Good morning. Hope you're all well and ready for another lesson. We've got about a month left of this term. It's whizzing by. Today's lesson is, I'll just give you the space to see what it is. Today's lesson is about the Nazi economy 1933 to 1945. Just before we start, just to quickly update you on one or two things. It was obviously good to see you last week, even though I only stood briefly at the back of the room and wasn't actually leading that session. Hope that went well for you. Thank you in anticipation of the essays that you should have uploaded. Well, for me, what would have been 2 days ago, because I'm recording this on the Tuesday, the 23rd. And I think that the deadline was actually, can't remember, was it Sunday or was it yesterday? Anyway, hopefully all those essays have been uploaded. They're the ones about Hitler, about his style of leadership, and was he a dictator who did not dictate. Look forward to reading those. The intention is I will video mark those as I've done as I have done the others since lockdown. Hopefully you find that you found that valuable, and I haven't had a chance to look at your self-evaluation in lockdown feedback yet, but hopefully you've submitted those as well. I'll enjoy sort of going through those and getting a sense of how you feel you've done and where you are with things. Yes, I'll be busy marking those essays over the next, probably the next couple of weeks. It does take a while. You're probably aware. Each of those is a personalised video that I record just for you. You can hear me mark your essay, and they usually take, depending on a range of factors, they usually take between 40 and 50 minutes each, and then I've got to upload. So yeah, so you get that feedback, and then it'll be the usual thing. I'll ask you to submit a self-evaluation. I'll create an assignment saying self-evaluation for essay 6 for you to upload that, but you can't do that obviously until after you've had the feedback. And just thinking ahead, I will set one more essay. Okay, haven't decided what it's going to be or what format it's going to be, and that will be coming in mid-July. So in about 3 or 4 weeks' time, but I'll get that out to you fairly soon. I think with this one, I'm going to probably I will set you the broad topic area, and then I'll actually say I'll give you the title of the question on the day that I want you to do it, and then you've got to basically have a window on that day. I'll give you, say, maybe 2 or 3 hours, but you won't have 2 or 3 hours. You've got to choose 45 minutes within that window to write your answer and then get it back to me within that period of time. Keep you on your toes a little bit in terms of like preparation. But just to give you sort of advance notice of that, and I'll get that out to you as soon as I can. Yeah, and then in terms of the remainder of this term, we've got one topic left in terms of my plan, which is this one here today, the Nazi economy 1933 to 45. I'll talk about that in a second in terms of the context. That will take us 3 lessons. That'll take us through to the first week in July. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, primarily because we haven't. Normally, we would lose lessons when you're on work experience week and when you're doing Year 12 exams, and that hasn't actually happened. What I will do though is I will basically push into the topics that we would do in Year 13. Okay, that we would be started to do in September. So we'll make a start on that this side of the quote summer holidays unquote. I think that'll be helpful to me and to you guys because Year 13 is pretty intensive anyway. And remember, in the timetable we go down from 3 hours a fortnight to 2 hours a fortnight. So it'll be good to just get a little bit of the water under the bridge there before the summer holidays in terms of covering material that we would be covering otherwise in September. So in other words, we'll start Depth Study 4. Yeah, and that's it. Let's push on. I'm putting my glasses on because I've got to start reading the screen. So just push myself out of the way there, and in actual fact, say because it does take up video space, I'm going to stop my recording after this particular slide, okay, my video recording. So as you can see, 3 lessons to cover the Nazi economy 1933 to 45, and we need 2 lessons to cover the peacetime years 1933 up to the outbreak of World War II. So that's today's lesson, and the next lesson, which will be on Monday, okay, and then the Nazi war or will it be Monday? I'm losing track. Our next lesson, whenever that will be, I'll be careful on that. It's the normal timetable, and then we need a 3rd lesson to focus in on the Nazi war economy 1939 to 45. In other words, World War II, what the economy was like in World War II. Okay, so there'll be 3 YouTube videos, this one and 2 others to cover those 3 lessons. Okay, and obviously, as always, watch the videos while you mind map. The purpose of Remember the Videos is I expand, give anecdotes, give further development and explanation that you can't just get by reading the slides or reading the notes. You need that sort of input, me talking you through. Okay, so we will push on. Okay, so you got without my video now. Okay, so there's the heading. So 2 lessons today's, and the next lesson is on the economy during the peacetime. So giving you the big picture, the big focus has been obviously on Hitler and Nazi Germany, and we had a whole series of lessons. We began with the, sorry, I just changed my pen, looking at the intensively 1933 to 35, and the last 2 lessons we've picked that up with racial policy. Okay, so that's the depth study, but then we've also got to look at the broad breadth study. Remember, the breadth study is society and economy, 1871 to 1990. So we've looked at Nazi society, picking it up from after the Weimar Republic up to 1945, and now we're picking up the Nazi economy. Again, we've studied the economy 1871 to 1932. We're now going to pick up the story of Germany's economic development during the Nazi era up to the end of World War II over these 3 lessons. So that gives you the context. And then we move into the final section of the course. Now, well, that looks like, well, we can cover that really quickly. That's the whole of year 13, okay, just to give you that sort of picture. So as you can see, we start off year 13 with the depth study 4, okay, which is basically the establishment of West Germany after World War II and the first 11 years of West Germany's history up to 1960. Okay, just do that all together, whole series of lessons in one go. We then pick up the breadth study economy from sorry, that's the mistake. I pick these things up occasionally. It's actually 1945 to 1990, because obviously we're doing the economy up to 1945 today, over these next 3 lessons. So that will be the focus after we've done depth study 4. We then go to depth study 5, which is about the reunification of Germany that culminated in a reunified Germany in 1990. And then we pick up the breadth study society again, and we go back to 1945, which is as far as we've got, and we follow it through to 1990. Okay, and that's year 13, but remember, we only have 2 hours a fortnight rather than 3 hours a fortnight in year 13, and anticipating the fact that because of the lockdown in year 12, obviously significant changes have happened in year 12, that we have to anticipate that we may need to spend a bit more time sort of like revisiting some of those year 12 topics, although really, to be honest, there won't be that much time because it's so busy in year 13, but hence the reason to sort of like start pushing into year 13 topics before the summer holidays. So hopefully that's clear for you in terms of the big picture. Okay, so the development of the German economy during the Nazi period, 1933 to 45. Okay, the best book is, again, go back to Stephen J. Lee, Hitler and Nazi Germany, chapter 7. Okay, and In particular, well, there are 2 essays in that chapter. Remember, there's always the background information at the beginning, which is very useful. Usually 1 to 2 sides just captures the facts. Then you have 2 essays. So you've got the first essay, How Have Historians Assessed Nazi Economic Policies between 1933 and 1939. So that's especially useful for today's lesson and the next lesson, where we're covering the periods 33 to 39. Then the second essay, how did Hitler's economic policies relate to his scheme for territorial expansion? That's especially useful and relevant for the third of these lessons, which is about the development of the Nazi economy during World War II. Okay, so those 2 essays. Now, the notes that follow on the slideshow and on the notes handout, which hopefully you printed off as you would normally do, and you've got in front of you, I've kind of like put them together. They've evolved over time, and they are actually a combination of information. They're in part notes from the textbook, which usually form the basis of my slideshows and the notes, but I've woven into my notes notes that I've taken from the first S.J. Lee essay. Okay, because it's very good, that first S.J. Lee, Stephen J. Lee essay. I've made my notes and I've incorporated them into the slideshow as appropriate, okay, as we go through this. So let's move on. Okay, so there's our mind map. Hopefully you've got that printed off and you've got it in front of you. Ideally stuck onto a sheet of A3 paper, so you've got plenty of space around the edge to mind map. Or if you're not using that approach, you've got an alternative approach for note making for this lesson, Cornell notes or whatever. And just to be clear, this is 2 lessons, so we will cover in this lesson Hitler's aims, the policies of Schacht, and the balance of payments issue. And then in our next lesson, we will pick up the other 3 strands about the new plan, the fall of Schacht, and the 4-year plan. Okay, so today's lesson, lesson 1, I've circled it for you, those 3 strands there. So in effect, we're only going to go halfway through this slideshow. This is a 37 slides on this slideshow. I think we're going to go slides 1 to 19 to cover those 3 strands. Okay, so Hitler's aims. Now again, hopefully the way I try to always teach is I'm always sort of like casting forwards as to what we're going to be doing and casting back on what we've previously done. So hopefully that your historical knowledge is building up in layers. So I'm constantly, in most lessons, making references to things we've already touched upon and things we're going to go on to. So there is the repetition of information that you've already covered, which again, part of the plan there is that it goes into your long-term memory and remember fingertip knowledge. So this particular slide, hopefully, at some point or another over the Depth Study 3, I've touched upon most of this, and so it should be fairly obvious to you. So in a nutshell, economic policy under the Nazis was closely entwined with foreign and military policy. So you've got 3 policy strands, okay? Which again, if you just think through that comment, it should make sense, okay? Well, I won't try to explain, but it'll become apparent as we sort of go through the information. So broadly speaking, there were 2 phases of policy. This is with regards to the Nazi period, 1933 to 39, okay, broadly speaking. The first phase was from 1933 to 37, okay, and that phase is sometimes called partial fascism. Okay, so fascism is the historical term we use to describe this sort of extreme right-wing form of dictatorship, such as existed in Hitler's Germany and in Mussolini's Italy. Okay, a fascist dictatorship. But it's called, this first phase is called partial fascism, as opposed to the second phase, which was from 1938 onwards, which is often called full fascism. Now, hopefully this will click as to what we mean by this, okay? Because during this first phase, 1933 to 37, the reason it was partial fascism is that Hitler, on the surface, did not have full control. He shared power with the Conservatives who had put him into office in 1933, the Conservative elites. It was a power-sharing arrangement on the surface. At least that's how the Conservatives saw it. But of course, we know that Hitler was establishing full control by stealth, but he was maintaining the illusion to the Conservatives that they still retained a degree of control, even though they actually didn't. Okay, so that's the sort of point about putting on a pretense of moderation. So these were the years in which Hitler was dependent on the support of his Conservative partners. Okay, and in particular, that was the case with regards foreign policy and economic policy, and to some extent military policy as well, all three of them. We've already touched upon all of those, okay? Those sort of three key objectives: economic policy to create jobs for the German people, foreign policy to maintain an illusion to the British and the French that his intentions were peaceful, not aggressive, and military policy that his rearming of Germany was for defensive purposes, not for aggressive purposes. Those are the three strands of policy. And in a sense, to maintain an illusion of moderation, the best thing to do is to put Conservatives at the front of those policies, okay, rather than have radical Nazis fronting those policies. So that was the sort of key thing. So overall, that was very much about in keeping the Allies happy that he wasn't a threat, okay? So that the economic policy was, in the years of partial fascism, was presented as being, it's about creating jobs for the German people. It's not about rearming for war, that sort of illusion. Foreign policy, likewise, we're pushing to have the Treaty of Versailles amended, but we don't want war, we just simply want what is just, okay? That's the illusion. Military policy, well, we want to have the restrictions of Versailles removed, so it's not fair to only have a small army of 100,000. We want to have an army, but that's for defensive purposes, so it's parity, so we can defend ourselves if necessary against external threats. It's not for aggressive purposes, okay? But then from 1938 onwards, he enters this second phase. And the second phase is Hitler can start dispensing with that illusion of moderation. I've used that sort of image like a lamb wearing wolf's clothes. Sorry, the other way around, a wolf wearing lamb's clothes. Hitler can dispense with the lamb's clothing, in a sense, and he can start basically revealing his true intentions. He couldn't do that in the first phase because it would be too risky, okay? If he bared his teeth and showed what he was really like, there was always the risk that the Conservative partners may ditch him and the Allies may choose to invade Germany. Okay, but from 1938 onwards, he's gone through that risky zone. Germany has now gone a long way towards rearming, and Hitler can see the hesitation in the Allies. So he can dispense with his Conservative partners. Hitler's less anxious about keeping the Allies happy. And from that point onwards, his policies were much, much more aggressive and expansionist. And there was absolutely a sea change in Hitler's attitude, where he became very much focused on his primary objective, which had always been there, but hidden, which was to prepare for a large war of eastward expansion for living space, to take land, in particular from the Soviet Union, which would be living space for the German people. Okay, so there for the first strand. Now this is a really useful little slide for you. Okay, so what I've done here is I put together a map of Europe as it was in the 1930s, and I've demonstrated Hitler's foreign policy really as steps. Now inevitably that's simplistic, Okay, it kind of, I mean, whole books have been written about Hitler's foreign policy, so to sort of like sum it up as a single slide is little bit risky. Okay, but it is important that you understand the main thrust of his foreign policy and the key things that happened, because that sits in the background of his economic policy, which is what these two lessons are about. So there's our first point in the top right, in the top left-hand corner. Hitler did not want to fight a war against Britain. Now, again, that's a little bit simplistic, okay? Because his objectives did change, and of course he did end up fighting a war against Britain at the start of World War II. I mean, that's what World War II was. Britain declared war on Germany. Hitler ended up with a war. But we've got to be very careful about that, because ultimately Hitler's objectives were to secure living space for the German people in the East. And that made basically, as we know it happened, of course, in 1939 he invaded Poland, and then in 1941, that was 1939. Might want to make a note of that, but hopefully you would know that anyway. That was the invasion of Poland, and then 1941 he invaded the Soviet Union. In a sense, think it through, okay? Why would Hitler not want a war with Britain? Well, because if he was fighting a war against Britain at the same time as fighting a war against Poland and the Soviet Union, then he would be fighting in two directions. He would be fighting in both the East and the West. Why did Germany lose World War I? Because Germany ended up fighting a two-front war. Her army was pulled in two different directions. And the whole basis of Hitler's foreign policy and his military plans is, he's not interested in conquering territory in the West, Britain and France. He's interested in the vast expanse of land to the east. Okay, Germany locked into what Hitler sees as a constraining frontiers and as a healthy, what he perceives as a healthy Aryan race. They need basically space to breathe, and that means they must conquer land in the east, take it from the countries which are populated by, in Hitler's mind, racial inferiors who don't deserve to have all the land they've got, and that land deserves to be given to the German people. So that's the sort of concept of living space in a nutshell. So therefore, logically, Hitler doesn't really want to fight a war against Britain. Okay, he can't really understand why Britain would want to fight a war with him. But what Hitler did learn throughout the 1930s is that increasingly Britain was not going to allow Hitler to achieve dominance on the continent. And of course, ultimately, Britain promised to protect Poland if Hitler attacked Poland. And then when, in 1939, Hitler did attack Poland, Britain declared war on Germany. That's not what Hitler wanted. Okay, he did not want to fight a war against Britain. Is the sort of key point there. Okay. So what then basically happened? Okay. So the first step, and this actually happened in 1938 and 1939, would involve absorbing Austria and Czechoslovakia into Germany. Okay. Now, of course, Hitler was an Austrian. Austria was largely populated by German people. Okay, and remember, go all the way back to 1871. Bismarck, in his wars that created Germany, actually made the choice. He thought about it: should Austria be included? Okay, in the newly created Germany. I mean, Prussia did defeat Austria in 1866, but Bismarck very cleverly chose not to include Austria, even though there was a strong argument in his head that Austria should be part of Germany because it was a largely German-speaking territory. But basically, step one would be to absorb Austria and Czechoslovakia into Germany. So looking at the arrows, you can see where Austria is. Now, Austria was absorbed in 1938, in March 1938. Then you've got this country, Czechoslovakia, and you think about the new territories, what the new frontiers. Once Austria was absorbed into Germany, Czechoslovakia becomes basically like a huge thorn sticking into Germany's side. So in Hitler's head, inevitably, Czechoslovakia needed to be absorbed and conquered by Germany as well, because once Austria and Germany, once Austria and Czechoslovakia, and I'll draw the lines here. Let me just get to my pen. Effectively, Austria was absorbed, so Germany's frontier pushed up to that line in 1938. Then, in late 1938, the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia was absorbed, which was the Sudetenland, or just kind of like, it was the area around the edge there. So Germany's frontiers sort of like then went up to that particular point in late 1938, and Hitler managed to do that without going to war, effectively. I mean, well, without ending up at war with Britain and France. I mean, France was allied to Czechoslovakia, but in the end, the British and the French abandoned Czechoslovakia, and Hitler got what he wanted. Then in March 1939, Germany invaded what we call the rump of Czechoslovakia and pushed the frontiers up to that line there. And at that point, you basically think you can sort of see what's happened is that there's been a big eastward expansion of Germany. And that's the sort of idea of step one, okay? Absorb Austria and Czechoslovakia. Then step two, Germany would invade Poland, using pretty much the same argument, because living in the Polish corridor, that area there, were lots of German people. Okay, as you can see, Germany was physically separated into two countries at the end of World War I, and that bit there, the broken away bit, was called East Prussia, and the bit in between that was given to Poland, a newly created country after World War I, was populated by a mixture of Poles and Germans. Okay, that area which we call the Polish corridor. Pulling back to step two, the trigger that initiated the Second World War, and it's not what Hitler wanted, was Hitler used the argument that Germany had a right to the Polish corridor, and what Hitler wanted to happen was basically for Poland to give him the Polish corridor, and that would then extend Germany's frontier along there. And imagine that Germany at that point, you've got a big frontier, and Germany would then be ready for the next stage, the final stage, step three, which would be to launch that bit, and you can see the big red arrow there, a big eastward invasion. And in Hitler's head, the date when that happened would probably be in the mid-1940s at some point, but it would clearly take a lot of time to prepare for this huge eastward drive for living space. And it would certainly involve, at some point in the future, a big war against the Soviet Union, because most of the living space in the East lay with the Soviet Union. Okay, but of course it all went wrong in 1939, because when Hitler invaded Poland for the Polish corridor, what happened is the British declared war on him. Okay, because they had promised to protect Poland, and that's not what Hitler wanted, and it's not what Hitler even expected, because what of course that then did is it meant he had to basically turn his back on the East, in a sense put to one side his big plan to invade the Soviet Union and sort out the British problem, because Britain had very annoyingly declared war on him in 1939. And so 1939 to 1940, in a sense, Hitler had to sort out Britain, okay? And the way to sort out Britain was basically he had to invade France and Belgium and Holland and Denmark and Norway, try to surround Britain, and then launch the big battle for Britain against Britain in 1940, which Britain did not surrender. Britain hung on. And then America ended up coming into the war on Britain's side, and so on and so forth. But that's another story, okay, which we'll look at in the next video about the economy during World War II. Okay, so that's a sort of a big picture there, okay. So Hitler's aims. Hitler's sole, this is the detail that sits underneath it, and this bit's taken from Lee, okay? So Hitler's sole interest in the economy, Germany avoid a repetition of the problems it faced during World War I. That's an important point, okay? Remember that in World War I, Germany was forced into a two-front war fighting in both East and West, and that caused Germany's economic collapse, which in turn caused the military collapse of 1918. So in terms of the economics, Hitler had really little interest or understanding of economics. There was no sort of coherent plan in January 1933. He was very happy to leave the non-Nazi experts in charge of the economy during these early years, 1933 to 37. And that's where this man Schacht, we'll come on to the next strand, is important, because Schacht was not a Nazi. That was the man that Hitler put into running the economy. But as far as there was a plan, it consisted of two stages. And economic policy broadly followed the same broad lines as foreign and military policy. And so there's that stage one, partial fascism. Okay, solve the problems resulting from the Great Depression, in particular create jobs, adopt a pose of reasonableness, and to a large extent hide his long-term aims and get the conservative experts working for him for economic recovery. And that's why he put Schacht as the front man in the economy. And then stage two from 1938 onwards, once the country was back to work fully, moved to the second more aggressive stage, which is producing weapons in readiness for that war of conquest in the East. And during that stage, Hitler moved to a much more aggressive stance, focusing on his long-term ideological aims. And that's the period in which he incorporated Austria into the Reich in 1938. It was risky, there was a risk of war, but he got away with it. And then he incorporated Czechoslovakia into the Reich in 1938 to 39. Again, there was a risk of war, but he took that risk because he was operating from a much stronger position at that point. He got away with it, didn't end at war with Britain. And then in 1939, he took that risk again, and he launched a war against Poland for the Polish corridor. But at that stage, the gamble failed because what Hitler did not want to happen happened. Britain declared war on him. And that, of course, meant he then had to sort out the British problem before he could launch his big invasion, long-term invasion, for living space. Okay, so, and at that point, this full stage, of course, he can dispense with the Conservatives, who are up to then were running the economy for him. So there's Hitler. Okay. Now let's again. You can pause and consolidate your notes there, but we're now going to move on to the next strand, which is this act. Okay, so again, we'll focus in on the in a nutshell, and then you can sort of like look at the notes and add the detail. So in a nutshell, Schacht was a conservative, not a Nazi. Okay, so just zoom in a little bit on this. And he was the man who was put in charge of running the economy during the period 1933 to 37. Okay, and the economy is sort of like one of the major government departments of any country. So very much highlights that if Hitler was actually, he did not want to put a Nazi running the economy. Okay, Nazis did not have the skills. Schacht was an old, long-established, respected international financier wizard. I mean, he went back a long time. In 1923, it was Schacht who basically he did the background work that pulled Germany out of the hyperinflation crisis. Schacht was the sort of man who came up with the Rentenmark, for example. Okay, so the whole world knew and admired this man Schacht, and he was not a Nazi. He came across as a conservative, respectable person. Okay, even though he was fundamentally very right wing and did support the Nazis and joined the Nazi government. Okay, so that's the key point. He was a conservative, not a Nazi. And like most conservatives, he supported Hitler to a point, okay? And he was fooled by Hitler wearing the lamb's clothing, okay? Because Hitler pretended that all he wanted was to strengthen Germany and did not want war. And that, of course, appealed very much to Schacht because the Conservatives did not want war. They simply wanted to have a strong leader who would strengthen Germany. So Hitler knew that he could trust Schacht in the short term to do the sort of like preparation work for war. Okay, but because of course the preparation work conceals the fact that the preparation is about war. The preparation work is theoretically the public message from Hitler, which the Conservatives fell for. It is just simply about making Germany stronger again, about creating jobs. But Hitler knew that in the long term he could not trust Schacht. Okay, so his short-term objective was put him in charge of the German economy. But eventually, when Hitler dispenses with his lamb's clothing and reveals his real intentions, which is an aggressive war of expansion for living space, clearly Schacht will have to go. And that's pretty much the story of what happened. Okay, so why was Schacht important? Well, as I say, he was internationally known. He was hugely experienced in economics. Putting Schacht at the front of the Nazi economy would command respect in all sorts of ways. It would command the respect of the German business community, and it would give them confidence, okay, that the country was being well led economically. But it would also give the international business community confidence that Germany had good leadership in economic matters, which would therefore open the way for investment from abroad in Nazi Germany. So Schacht's main objective then, remember, Schacht, given the job, under a pretense, and Schacht does not know what the pretense is. Schacht does not really know or fully appreciate or understand that the ultimate objective is of the work that he is doing is to prepare for a big war for living space in the East eventually in 10 years' time. Well, Schacht doesn't realise, in a sense, that that's the long-term reason he's being given this job. Okay, Schacht's understanding is his main objective is to pull Germany out of the Great Depression, create jobs for the German people, get the country trading again, restore wealth. Okay, and the point is Schacht was incredibly successful. If you look at the years 1933 to 36, when Schacht took on the job in 1933, there were 6 million Germans unemployed. By 1936, the vast majority of those unemployed Germans were back in work. The country was in a strong footing by 1936. The country had recovered much of its trade, etc. Okay, and that's really what we're talking about here. So we need to understand what Schacht did. So he used very ambitious schemes based on the new idea, what we call deficit financing. Okay, so we'll come on to that in a second, what deficit financing was. In the background, though, restoring full employment indirectly prepared the way for Germany to start rebuilding her army. And of course, Schacht knew that. He could see that the wealth that was being created was now being poured into the military. But, sorry, I've lost the final sentence there. But Schacht believed that rearmament, the reason that Germany was building up a big army under Hitler, was for defensive purposes. Okay, he didn't know or appreciate the fact that the real intention was to prepare Germany to launch a big eastward invasion at some point in the mid-1940s. Okay, so that's part of the illusion, and Schacht was, in a sense, hoodwinked. Okay, like most of the Conservatives were, by the pretense that Hitler was putting on. Okay, so now here's the detail. Now again, don't get worried too much about the detail. You do need to know it. Okay, remember, this is a breadth study topic. So in the exam, you're going to be writing in 45 minutes about 120 years of Germany's economic development. And within that 45 minutes, you're only going to be able to write one paragraph really about the Nazi era in 1933 to 45. But at the same time, it can't be woolly. You've got to get some sort of like relevant material in there. So just picking out some of the words in bold. Okay, so there's the appointment of Schacht. Okay, his job was, he was the president of the Reichsbank, but he was also the Minister of Economics. So he actually had two jobs. Okay, we've said that there about those points, covered that in a nutshell. Okay, now Schacht's early policies. He created a supervisory office for banking to oversee the German banking system. Okay, and And Schacht believed in what we call deficit financing. And what that basically meant is deficit financing was this sort of economic theory, and it's still very much known and understood and respected today as a strategy that governments can use, is that a government should, if a country is in economic crisis, a government should intervene. Okay, and there should be government intervention in the nation's economy by spending large sums of money on public schemes. Okay. Now, to do that, the government may need to borrow money, okay, which will put the country further into debt, what we call the balance of payments. Okay. But by spending money, you generate wealth. Okay. Because if you're investing and you have to borrow the money to do it, effectively you're putting money into the economy, which is almost like kick-starting it. And so businesses will start to produce, jobs will be created. If jobs are created, people start earning money. If people start earning money, then they will want to spend the money on consumer goods, for example. That will basically create an incentive for businesses to make more goods, and you then start to get this sort of upward spiral of growth. Once that happens, the government can then start taxing the wealth, introducing higher taxation. So wealth is taxed either from people's income, because people are now in jobs, or from the trade that will happen once wealth is generated. That could be trade within the country, between Germans, or between Germany and other countries. And if the government can tax that wealth that's being created, then ultimately that provides the means for the government to pay back the debts that they have had to, they've had to borrow money to get this kick-started. Okay, so it's like short-term increasing in your debts that will generate growth, that will generate wealth that you could then use to pay off your debts. Okay, and that's the sort of idea of deficit financing in a nutshell. Okay, Google it, but it's just understanding that sort of basis, and that's basically the essence of what Schacht's policies were about. So examples of that: between 1933, 5,000 million marks was invested in public work programs by Schacht, and of course the most famous, you probably know it from GCSE history, was the famous motorway building program, the Autobahns. That was hugely important to Hitler. It was like a sort of like a huge propaganda image of national unity, the country pulling together. But from Schacht's point of view, it was a big part of his deficit financing, because public money was poured into this, and it basically meant that all men aged 18 to 25 had to basically give 6 months national labour service, a very, very low pay, doing their bit for the country, building the roads. And that was a big factor that led ultimately to the fall of unemployment, because it did stimulate economic growth. It did. All sorts of businesses had to provide for the Autobahn, produce what was needed for it, and that generated growth in itself. And it was a big factor that led to the decline in unemployment from 6.1 million ultimately to 1.7 million by the end of 1935. And then another scheme, again, the classic example of deficit financing, which I would definitely mention, is what we call MIFO bills. And it was a key feature of deficit financing. And basically, these were government contracts, business deals that the German government made with big industrial companies. And so Schacht, as the Minister of Economics, would make a deal with a huge industrial company, I don't know, to provide to provide sort of iron and steel for the building of I don't know, the Volkswagen cars, for example, was another sort of project. Okay, and or to provide the whatever was needed for building roads. As you can see, I'm not really much of an expert on building, but the stuff. Don't use the word stuff in your essays, but basically the government needed to employ German businesses to enter contracts. And when a government enters a contract with a business, it's the same as a private person entering into a contract with a business. Basically, the business will say, "Yeah, I'll give you what you want, but you got to pay. You got to pay me for it." Well, the point about MIFO bills is the German government said, "Yeah, we will pay for you for it, but we won't pay for it with you yet. We'll pay you in IOU notes, like bits of paper." And that's what MIFO bills were. They were basically bits of paper that said, "We will owe you. We will pay you back in 4 years' time." Okay. And the company, and there's the long name for it, that produced those credit notes that would be converted into money in 4 years' time, that's where the word MIFO comes from, and the concept of MIFO bills. So that's a big factor in how Germany spent money they didn't have. Okay, they basically spent using IOU notes. It's like saying, provide us with what we need and we'll give you the money back in 4 years' time when we have it. So 12,000 million marks worth of MIFO bills were issued. And actually, much of the rearmament programme, because Hitler did not waste any time, the Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from rearming, but Hitler did it secretly. Okay, started pretty much in 1933-34. And it was happening behind the scenes. But one of the advantages of using MIFO bills to fund rearmament is that it didn't appear in any accounting. It was hidden. Okay, and the British and the French and the Americans, part of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, they had to maintain, they had to inspect Germany's books, Germany's accounts, to watch out that Germany was not actually spending any of her national income on making weapons, because the Treaty of Versailles didn't allow her to do that. Well, basically, much of the expenditure on rearmament was hidden away through this particular scheme. Okay, so half of rearmament expenditure was funded using MIFO bills. Also, it meant the government avoided inflationary spending. Because if you overspend with real money, there's always a risk that it could create that inflationary spiral that happened in 1923. But because basically the government is spending money that doesn't actually exist at this point, it was a way of basically ensuring that inflation did not happen. Okay, and I put there in italics, MB, spending creates jobs, jobs stimulates demand. If demand outstrips supply, inflation results. Okay, so that was a way around that particular problem. The additional benefit of hiding the government debt, I've already said, okay, from the German people. And with time, as the economy recovered and as unemployment dropped, the Nazi was able to move away from using MIFO bills to finance rearmament and using taxation and loans instead. Okay, so they were a short stopgap measure, part of deficit financing to get the economy kick-started, and that's what MIFO bills were. So the big thing is here, there was definite government intervention. Okay, is that under the Nazis, immediate government intervention by a strong economic leader to kickstart the economy. Okay, so government intervention is one of the big themes that you tend to get in section C of the exam. Now this is the bit from Lee, but so it largely repeats some of these points. But let's see what Lee says about this. So Hjalmar Schacht dominated Nazi economic policy. We've said that. Those are there his two positions: Minister of the Reichsbank, Minister of Economics. We've said conservative nationalist, not a Nazi. He was a wizard financier. There's the bit about deficit financing, Autobahn construction, afforestation, sort of like cutting down forests to clear the way for airports that we know would eventually be used for the German Air Force in war, etc., but it was never presented that way. All of these projects, I mean, it's the same with the Autobahn construction. In a sense, it served a military purpose because Hitler would eventually use these autobahns to move tanks to the front lines, etc. But of course, the Allies can't say, "Oh, you're breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles by building motorways." Okay, so it's kind of like hidden rearmament. It's the infrastructure for to prepare for war. Public buildings, big public building works as well. There again was sort of like national prestige projects, a way of sort of like demonstrating strength and unity and pulling the people together. So as I say, many of those schemes would have laid the infrastructure, the groundwork for later rearmament. Okay, you can't, like the Allies can't sort of like say to Hitler when he starts chopping forests down, that's breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles because you're preparing for war. Hitler would say, well, I'm just basically chopping forests down, even though we know that he wants to do that to build airports and runways that will be used by the Luftwaffe when war eventually starts. The main visible outcome was that unemployment dropped. Okay, so we've said that, which boosted Hitler's popularity. And again, that's all how it all ties in, isn't it? The building of a Hitler myth. Wow, Hitler's created jobs for the German people. So although, as we've already seen with society, there were many reasons that most Germans had to doubt Hitler and to be anxious about the Nazis and their loss of their freedoms, etc., etc. Equally, many Germans said, well, he has created jobs, he has sorted out communism and socialism, etc., etc. Okay, and that's part of the building of the Hitler myth to a new level. The other thing is, all of this took place in the context of world economic recovery. The Great Depression was a world depression, and it began in 1929, and much of the evidence shows that it really peaked in 1932, the end of 32, moving into 1933. The point is what a great moment for Hitler to come into power. It's almost like across the world, there was a wave from 1933 onwards of international recovery. Okay, the Great Depression had bottomed out in 1932, beginning of 33, but across the world, things were beginning to recover just at the point when Hitler took power. So it's quite odd, although you can say, well, yes, the solving of unemployment was all sorted out by Schacht and his schemes. Much of when Hitler, of course, took credit for that, much of the recovery would probably have happened anyway, even if Hitler hadn't taken power and somebody else had taken power. Okay, so that's an important factor. Okay, that needs to sit in the background and just needs to be understood. Okay, so check your understanding. I've just put 3 questions there. Pause the video. Would you be able to articulate an answer to those 3 questions? Hopefully the answer is yes. If not, rewind and play the video again. Okay, so we've done 2 of the 3 strands. One last strand then to do, and the issue about balance of payments. Okay, so I mentioned the word balance of payments a little bit earlier. Okay, easy way to understand balance of payments: think about you or think about your parents. Okay, I can use myself as an example. A government is just like basically a human being. Okay, and as a human being, I think of myself. I have income. I have my job that gives me income, and so I have money, and I spend that money. Okay, and of course, in an ideal world, you would only spend the money you've got, but the real world is people borrow money. Okay, for me, for adults, and hopefully you're not too far down this slippery slope. What it means is that you have a credit card. Okay, a credit card basically means that you use that, and you can make purchases on your credit card, even though you haven't got the money to at that point in time to pay it back. But basically, hopefully in a month's time when the credit card bill comes through, you will have your salary will have come through by then, and you can pay off the debt that you've incurred maybe 4 weeks later. Okay, that's kind of like the idea. So it's a bit of short-term overspending. Short-term, you're spending money you don't have, knowing that when I get my wage check through, I'll then be able to pay off the money on the credit card bill. Another example, of course, is a mortgage. When you buy a house, the vast majority of people don't kind of save up. They don't spend years and years and years saving up hundreds of thousands of pounds and then buy the house only when they've saved the money, because by the time you've done that, you're probably, old enough to retire. So people borrow money to buy a house, and that's called a mortgage. Money that has been lent to you, given to you, to help you buy a house. But you've got to pay that money back, and you pay that money back over usually 25 years. So most of us live in debt, okay? And a balance of payments basically means that your expenditure is greater than your income. And that's the difference, okay? You take your income and you measure it to an amount, and then you take your expenditure. And if your expenditure is greater than your income, then there is a negative number. And that basically means, in human terms, that's an overdraft. You've spent money you haven't got. Okay. Well, it's the same with governments. Okay. If a government is spending more than it has, and a government's income is generated through all sorts of means, international trade, taxation, for example. Okay. Governments tax the people. They tax wealth generated by trade. So the government's income comes from a range of sources, but if the government spends more than its income, then it is building up a balance of payments problem, and its bank account is in deficit. Okay, a deficit means you're spending more than your income. Okay, so there's a little bit of background about that. Okay, so let's talk about what the balance of payments issue was. Okay, so in a nutshell, resolving unemployment by making weapons, and say through rearmament, and rearmament in the broad sense of the word. Okay, remember, strictly speaking, making motorways is part of rearmament. Strictly speaking, afforestation and building, preparing the way, draining swamps is part of rearmament. Okay, creating huge industrial concerns that can extract coal and iron from the ground is part of rearmament. Okay, because you can't start making weapons until you've got the factories built. Okay, so the emphasis under Schacht was building what we call the infrastructure, the groundwork for rearmament. And of course, Hitler didn't waste any time. Those factories did start making weapons, but of course much of that was hidden away because it was funded by MIFO bills, and so it managed to escape being noticed by the Allies. That was all happening. But all of that created jobs, okay? But it came at a price. Now this is the thinking, okay? People got jobs. You'd have thought that's great, that's wonderful, okay? But when people get jobs, it puts money into their pockets, okay? And so ordinary people, if they're unemployed, if they're out of work, they haven't really got that much money to spend, and they tend to stay at home, okay? Now you're back at work, you're being paid a salary, okay? You've got to use some of that to basic expenditure, like you pay for your mortgage and feed your family. But hopefully you've got a bit left over to spend on other things, on what we call consumer goods, okay? Nice things, okay? So creating jobs builds up the German consumers. And those German consumers, ordinary people like you and me, want to basically go down the shops on Saturday, or they want to go onto, obviously we now go onto Amazon, we have a little bit of a browse and think, oh, what nice do I want to buy? What do I want to buy myself that's nice? Okay. Well, it was the same in the 1930s. By 1935, you've got lots of German consumers who've got jobs that didn't have jobs 2 years earlier. Now they've got jobs and they want to spend their money. So they want German businesses to start making consumer goods. Okay. Or they want German businesses to buy consumer goods from abroad to sell to them. Okay. Now Hitler obviously wants to keep his consumers happy. They're the German public. Okay. Hitler does not want to be an unpopular dictator. Hitler knows that his power is based on popular support. Okay. So Hitler is hell bent on boosting his popularity. But the problem is, if you've now got consumer demand from ordinary people who want German businesses to make consumer goods for them, German businesses are being pulled in two directions, because Hitler wants the German businesses to make weapons for him. Okay? So there's a tension there, that the stronger the economy gets, the greater the pressure on German businesses to not make weapons, but to now start making consumer goods for the German people. Okay, so the problem was, how could a healthy economy make both weapons and consumer goods? And when you hear about this, you often see guns v butter. And that's just really a metaphor, okay? A lot of the textbook use this phrase. I'm not sure where that phrase actually came from, but that basically was the situation that had been reached by 1936. Schacht did a great job creating jobs, but by 1936 there was that tension. What's our priority? Because we can't do both, okay? So a tension there. Now we'll look more at that in the second video. Secondly, okay, so remember, this is the price of creating jobs. The second price is this. Full employment also meant that there was a labour shortage. Okay? Again, think it through. When you've got unemployment, there is basically an excess of workers on the market. So therefore work is cheap. Okay? If you're a owner of a factory and there are 6 million people out of work, those people are going to take a job working for you, and you can basically say, well, I'm not going to pay you very much, because if you're not happy with it, then the next person on the dole queue out there will take the job. Okay, so basically, if you've got lots of unemployed, the control is given to the bosses. Okay, they can determine low wages, and of course, it's not right, but nevertheless that is the way a capitalist economy works. The owner of a business wants to maximize their profits, and the best way to maximize your profits is to pay your workers less. So unemployment is a great context really for the bosses. Okay, but by 1935-36, because of Schacht's successes, Germany is moving towards full employment. So now that you've got full employment, there's a shortage of workers on the market, okay? And workers knew that, okay? A worker could be enticed to leave his place of work and say to his boss, look, I'm going to go because the factory down the road will pay me more. And the boss will probably say, well, I don't want you to leave because there aren't any unemployed workers out there to fill your job. Please stay with me. So the workers will therefore press, well, yeah, I'll stay with you, but I want higher wages for that. Okay, it's basic laws of the way economies work. So when you've got full employment, workers will press for higher wages, and the bosses will probably have to pay them higher wages to keep them. So if their wage demands are met, what's going to have to happen? The boss, who's making whatever his company makes, is going to have to basically increase the price of the goods that he is making when he sells them on the market, because he basically has got to generate additional income to pay these high wages that the workers are demanding. So can you see what's happening? Wages go up, prices go up. What are the workers then going to say? I want increased wages, because now things are becoming more expensive in the shops. So the workers' wages go up And the same happens again and again and again. And you then get what we call an inflationary spiral. Basically, prices start going up and up and up. So thinking this through, in any economy, you've got two major problems. You've got unemployment and you've got inflation. And they tend to work in opposites like scales. When you've got low unemployment, prices tend to go up. That's what happened in 1935-36. When you've got high unemployment, okay, it's not great, lots of people out of work, inevitably prices tend to be fairly low in the shops. Okay? So that's the sort of tension there that Hitler had to face in 1935-36 when Germany reached a position of full employment. But Hitler wanted to keep wages low, because if you've got this inflationary spiral and prices are going up and up and up, then what's happening? Think about it. The wealth of the economy that's been generated by economic growth, that's sitting in the bank accounts of all these businessmen, where's it going? It's going in to the pockets of the workers, and it's being ultimately spent on consumer goods, because the incentive now is for the businesses to make consumer goods, not weapons, because the businessman is going to basically think, what's the best thing for me to make? And if wages are going up, and the 50 million German people want basically business, the economy to manufacture consumer goods, then ultimately that's going to take away from rearmament. So Hitler would therefore rather keep wages low so that surplus money could fund rearmament. Okay, so hopefully that was a little bit basic lesson in economics. I mean, you don't need to write all this down in the exam. It's just, I think, in the back of your mind, understanding those concepts, which sit beneath the surface when you're writing about economic history. Okay, so thirdly, a third problem that comes out of it, that's kind of related to the first two anyway, is that when a country is rearming, spending its money on making weapons rather than consumer goods, that also created a balance, what we call the balance of payments problem. Okay, because to manufacture weapons, which is what Hitler wanted to happen, you need raw materials, okay? Now, the problem with Germany is Germany was not a huge, big country. It sat in the middle of Europe, and this was, again, Hitler's sort of like main anger, is that Germany was confined within frontiers. And that's the case with all countries. And the raw materials that you need to manufacture what you want to make, whether it's consumer goods or weapons, okay, some of those raw materials you can basically extract from your own country because it's in your own ground, okay, iron and coal, etc. But if you don't have enough raw materials, well, what do you have to do? You've got to buy it from abroad, okay, and that's called imports. So if Hitler is expecting businesses to make weapons, then inevitably those businesses say, well, we'll enter into a contract with the government, we'll make you weapons, but unfortunately, to make you weapons, we're going to have to basically buy this, this, and this. Okay, so for example, rubber. Okay, if we're going to make your tanks, the treads of the tanks, we'll need rubber. Germany doesn't have any rubber in its own ground. I mean, rubber you basically get from sort of like countries in hotter parts of the world. Okay, and Germany doesn't have natural supplies of rubber, so Germany will need to basically import rubber from abroad. German businesses will have to import rubber. They're going to have to buy it from abroad, okay, to be able to make the tanks that Hitler wants to be made. Okay, and so therefore businesses are going to have to cover the cost of those imports in their overheads, and that basically means when they sell the tanks to the German government, it's going to basically be more expensive for Hitler. So you can see why Hitler wants to keep wages low. Okay, so Germany was importing essential materials from abroad that was needed for rearmament. It meant that she was basically therefore importing more than she was exporting. And that therefore is putting the country into debt. Okay, so it's a little bit like when you go on holiday. Okay, when you go abroad, you've got to basically, you're spending money abroad, aren't you? Okay, you go on holiday abroad. What do? You go to the bank and you ask for foreign currency. Okay, and that's basically what was happening with German businesses. To buy essential materials for rearmament from abroad, they had to go to the national bank and they had to say, we need foreign currency. And Hitler had to give them, or Schacht had to give the businesses foreign currency to import what they needed. But those foreign currency supplies were running low. Now, to top up your foreign currency supplies, what have you got to do? You've got to sell some goods abroad to generate foreign currency. You've got to get the money coming in the other way. But Hitler doesn't want to sell goods abroad because he wants the wealth of the country to be diverted into making weapons. So in effect, Germany was building up a huge overdraft there. Okay, she was spending more than she actually had, and that was creating pressure. So that kind of like reaches the point about how Schacht tried to resolve these problems, okay, that were increasingly mounted. And one of his main strategies was a set of policies that he introduced in 1934 called the New Plan, okay, and that's the next lesson. This is why we need 2 lessons on. Okay, so bit of more detail then. Okay, you can pause the video and pick up in particular the points in bold. And again, I return to the same point I made earlier. This is a breadth study. You don't need to have a few. It's important you understand and you include some precise material, but don't get too much worried about the detail. It's more the understanding that's the important thing. Okay, so I think most of these points we've now covered. The main basis of German industrial recovery was rearmament. We've said that. Okay. Germany was still subject to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which meant that when Hitler did start, businesses did start making weapons for him, it was important that rearmament was disguised. Okay, that's a new point. Okay, it was partly disguised because of the MIFO bills, because it was being funded for by money that didn't exist, but also a lot of building autobahns is part of rearmament. Okay, draining swamps, chopping down forests is part of rearmament for the reasons I've already said. It's the infrastructure, isn't it? Building factories is part of rearmament because you can't make tanks until you've got factories, etc., etc. Extracting coal and iron from the ground is part of rearmament. Buying rubber from abroad is part of rearmament. But of course, you can disguise it by claiming it's for other things, and that's pretty much how the Nazis did it and how Schacht did it. Okay, so an example of that, Krupp's contracts for tanks were massed as agricultural tractor building. Okay, when aeroplanes were being built, we know they were being built for military use, but they were massed as if they were for commercial use. And when the war broke out, they just simply put the logos onto the planes and take the seats out, etc., etc. Okay, there's different ways around it, and that's how they did it. So rearmament in itself created many jobs. We've done that. Okay, it stimulated the economy, deficit financing, definitely. But this caused demand to outstrip supply in several ways. So Germany's raw materials industry was not able to supply the demand for rearmament, and so Germany had to import necessary raw materials. I gave you the example of rubber. Okay, oil was another one. Okay, Germany didn't have natural supplies of oil. It's all very well building the tanks and making the aeroplanes, but you've got to basically buy oil from abroad. So Germany had to use its valuable foreign exchange supplies to buy oil from abroad. That was the problem. But Hitler doesn't like having to pay for the imports in the way normal people do. Sort of normal people, if you're going to basically buy things from abroad, you're going to sell them something in return. But Hitler doesn't like selling things in return because he sees that as the wealth of the country going elsewhere. He wants Germany to be self-sufficient and to be able to manage without being dependent on buying and selling with other countries. Okay. And the problem is this: you've got this additional problem of consumer demand, which is like putting pressure on businesses to provide consumer goods. And so Hitler says, well, we've got to keep wages down to stop that happening. But if you keep wages down, then the people will be unhappy. And Hitler doesn't want that either. All these these tensions and contradictions, they all come out of basically a growing economy. So it sounds funny, but a growing economy, you'd thought would create, happiness and a perfect world, but actually economic growth creates a whole new set of problems, which is what we're talking about here. So the balance of payments problem was made even worse because as unemployment increased, the spending power of the German people increased, we've said that, which increased the demand for the economy to produce consumer goods, we've said that. So when demand is greater than the supply of goods, there's that risk of inflation, that sort of spiral that we talked about, okay, going up. And Hitler wanted to keep wages depressed to stop that spiral because he doesn't want surplus money going out of the country. He wants surplus money being used to fund rearmament. Okay, but all in all, if you've got basically a combination of high prices and low wages, which is the risk, then that's going to impact on the standard of living, and that's going to damage Hitler's popularity with the German people. So how do you square the circle and make both weapons and consumer goods, make both guns and butter, keep the people happy? You can't do all of those things, okay? That's the problem, okay? Unless you're prepared to basically export goods to pay for the imports, become a conventional trading country, the way other countries work. Hitler doesn't want to do that. Hitler wants basically divert wealth into rearmament. So that's where we are. Okay, there are three strands, so plenty to think about there. The important thing is that your conceptual understanding of these issues is sound, so you may want to just go back through and think through those issues, okay? And then we'll pick up the story in the next lesson. We'll look at the new plan, and then we'll look at the fall of Schacht, why ultimately Schacht had to go, and then the final stage of absolute focus on preparation for war. When the Nazis took over the running of the economy, a man called Goering was put in charge, and the 4-year plan was announced in 1936, but we'll do that next lesson. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.